I was asked by IPS to address the following issues in my presentation. Four issues. One, Pakistan's response to the situation. Two, survey of the interests of Pakistan in the region and beyond. Three, implications for refusing to support the Western Bloc on the issue. And four, policy options available to Pakistan. Let me address all these issues in the order that I will speak. First of all, I want to talk about the global geopolitical context of the Ukraine crisis and how this is impacting on our region first, how it's impacting on Pakistan, and then how and what are the options for Pakistan in the years and days ahead. So, as far as the global geopolitical context is involved, I'm sure you have discussed this in the earlier part of this seminar, but for the sake of continuity of my presentation, allow me to make some brief comments here. In my thinking, the United States, after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, when it emerged as a sole superpower, pursued a zero-sum policy in which it was determined not to allow any other peer competitor to emerge on the international scene. This was driven by several factors, most importantly, I think, by the arrogant belief that the United States and its ideology presented the only course of action that other countries must emulate, must follow. They must become so-called democracies and free market economies. And that is why scholars wrote about the end of history, and some even wrote about the clash of civilizations. But essentially, the Americans were driven by the clear-cut geopolitical objective of ensuring that they remain and sustain their unique unipolar status in the world for the foreseeable future. Now, in order to pursue that objective, the US built up its capacities around the world, particularly focusing on two countries that could conceivably challenge America's unipolar status. One was, of course, China. And for that reason, the US, as you all know, pursued a policy which later became known as pivot to Asia or rebalancing to Asia. And in that process, developed several strengthened existing alliances with countries like Japan and Australia, New Zealand and others, while building new alliance systems with countries like India and Vietnam, etc. So what emerged was the so-called Quadrilateral Alliance, and now more recently AUKUS, which is between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. The purpose of these alliances simply being to contain and, if necessary, to confront China. The ostensible purpose, of course, that was being pursued or projected was to ensure a so-called rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific region and to ensure freedom of navigation and freedom of aviation in this area. In Europe, or against a rising or resurgent Russia, the United States pursued a policy whereby it sought to enhance its alliance with the Western and then in the Eastern Bloc countries as they broke away from the Soviet Union to enhance NATO as a means of containing Russia. Now, obviously, these kind of US unipolar policies generated considerable concern amongst the Russians and the Chinese, and they moved closer to each other, evolving a strategic partnership of their own, which is symbolized by the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between Russia and China, as well as by the formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, apart from several other bilateral agreements. Now, coming to the Ukraine situation itself, when even before the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Soviet leadership at the time Mr. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system had become dysfunctional. He needed to focus on his country's economic reforms and rebuild the country, and for that reason needed outreach and support from the United States and the Western countries as a whole. And for that reason, he agreed to two very important developments. One, the disintegration or the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance that the Soviet Union had created against NATO. And the second was the process of democratization in the former Soviet allies in Eastern Europe, including the reunification of Germany. Now, at that time, the American President George Bush assured Mr. Gorbachev that NATO will not expand, and that he recognized Soviet concerns about the expansion of NATO to Soviet borders. And this was a assurance that is recorded, but it was not, unfortunately, not given in writing. But the assurance, there is no doubt of the fact that such an assurance was given by George Bush Sr. However, after Bush, when President Clinton came into being, and this whole ideological fermentation in the United States had taken place, that the US was number one and should always remain number one, Clinton moved away from this commitment to the Soviets. And by that time, of course, the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, and the successor state of Russia, which was extremely weak and had very weak leadership in the person of Mr. Chernenko and Mr. Yeltsin, was unable to stand up to this. Although Yeltsin did argue that after the dissolution of Warsaw Pact and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the raison d'etre for the existence of NATO no longer existed, because if you recall that NATO had been created to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union in Europe. And the other thing that Yeltsin said is that if you do want to maintain NATO, then recognize Russia as a European power and include Russia into Ukraine, into NATO. But the Americans, of course, did not take Yeltsin very seriously. They rejected all this, and over a period beginning from about 1991, 92, a process of NATO expansion began, and it moved very close to Russia's western borders, creating what Russia has always seen as an existential threat. Remember that in Russian history, it has always, or not always, but for most of the time, been invaded from the west by the Swedes, by the Prussians, by the French, and then by the Germans as well. So for them, the vulnerability of their western borders is a very important problem. The red line, of course, was Ukraine. Now, Ukraine-Russian relations are very complicated. They have been part of the same political entity, Kievan Rus, for centuries. And there is in Ukraine, particularly in Western Ukraine, is predominantly Ukrainian-speaking people who are Catholics, and in the east of Ukraine are mainly Russian-speaking people, Russian ethnic origin people who are Russian Orthodox Christians. So there's this kind of a complication as well. So when in 2014, the US and NATO countries tried to bring about regime change, not tried, but actually did bring about regime change by sponsoring a movement, the so-called Orange Revolution, against the Ukrainian leaders who were pro-Moscow, that led to the Russians reacting through the use of force, and their primary interests were to protect the Russian speaking people in the larger Donetsk region, on their borders, as well as taking hold of Crimea, because the Crimea is where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is stationed, and that created the first wave of the crisis. In 2015, these countries reached the Minsk Agreement, Russia and Ukraine, or according to which the Ukrainians agreed that they would provide a greater autonomy to the Russians in Ukraine, while also recognizing Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine. However, the implementation of this agreement did not take place. But since the issue of Ukraine's membership of NATO receded into the background, the situation kind of normalized, and other areas took over in Russian-American relations. Now, since the beginning of 2022, this issue was revived. Unwisely, I think, because the Russians had already demonstrated that this was a red line, and the US and its NATO partners continued to arm and fund the Ukrainians, in fact, encouraging them to pursue a more belligerent attitude towards Russia, and on the other hand, of course, the Russian positions also became more and more belligerent, leading up to the Russian invasion and occupation of certain parts of Ukraine. Now, the important question is, how is this going to end? And despite the Western narrative, which I would take with a very big pinch of salt, because the Western narrative is obviously very biased. The fact of the matter is that since this is an existential issue for the Russians, I do not see President Putin making any compromise short of an ironclad commitment by the Ukrainians and the NATO countries that Ukraine will not now and not ever in the future become a part of NATO. That, I think, is bottom line. Other than that, of course, they can work it out, but that is the kind of assurance he wants, and he wants it in writing. All this could have been avoided had the NATO countries been willing to give such an assurance. But now, in view of the situation, they are ready to agree to Ukrainian neutrality status like Finland or Austria, which can ensure that in future Ukraine will not become a part of NATO. But it remains to be seen. But I think the bottom line is very clear. Now, coming to our region, I think the region has been impacted partially or more recently to a certain extent by the Ukraine crisis. But the bigger problem for this region has come about as a result of the American zero-sum policy, which I referred to, and the global geopolitical confrontation between the three major powers. As a result of that, the United States and India have entered into a strategic partnership which is aimed at containing and confronting China. As a result, as I mentioned, the Quadrilateral Alliance, AUKUS, have been created. At the same time, the US and India have entered into four major so-called, what are they called? Four major agreements for arms transfers, technology transfers, military cooperation, foundational agreements. So they are very closely involved in this kind of mutual defense cooperation to contain and confront China. This obviously has a direct impact on Pakistan's security because as India's military capabilities are modernized and enhanced, the threat to Pakistan will increase because these capabilities can also be used against Pakistan. Another factor is that with this kind of American backing, the Indian government of Prime Minister Modi has become more and more belligerent, more and more aggressive, creating situations such as what we saw, the confrontation in February 2019. And I would think, in my view at least, this recent missile intrusion that we saw was a deliberate act rather than a mistake or an accident. Because if you link it to similar intrusions by Indian submarines into Pakistani waters, it shows that this is a means that Indians are trying to test our responses. So they are becoming more and more belligerent in their attitude towards Pakistan. And of course, we know also that their strategic doctrine has been moving away from the so-called commitment to no first use of nuclear weapons towards a preemptive first strike against Pakistan. So that indicates how the convergence of interests with the US has impacted on India's policies. The Chinese have, of course, not remained silent or they have reacted to these developments, and in anticipation of a potential American capability to block the sea lanes in the Indian and Pacific Oceans on which 80% of China's trade depends, the Chinese have tried to create an alternative continental land connectivity project, which, as you know, is called the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, of which CPEC is a key part. And so CPEC and the Pakistan-China partnership has also emerged. On the one hand, it has emerged as an important factor for Pakistan's own capabilities to enhance its own capabilities and protect its own regional interests, but at the same time has also emerged as an irritant in relations between Pakistan and the United States. So another element, of course, that evolves from all this is that because of the China-Russia partnership against the United States, the avenues have opened up with China's facilitation to Pakistan-China relations being developed in a way that has not been there for at least several decades. For instance, China was the country that ensured Pakistan's membership of the SCO. And we know that a lot of technology, including defense technology, first from Russia, first came through Pakistan via China, and now to a certain extent is also coming directly through Russia. The Russians are also interested in the gas pipeline project and several other projects with Pakistan. And most importantly, I think both China, all three, China, Pakistan, and Russia, and perhaps even can include Iran, are interested in two very important areas or have converging interests in two very important areas. One, peace and stability in Afghanistan, which is important for all of them in order to contain the problem of terrorism, in order to contain the problem of drugs. And the second is regional connectivity, which is absolutely essential for China, essential for Pakistan to realize its pivotal position as a bridge to the rest of Central and West Asia, and perhaps if relations improve with India, with South Asia as well. So these are all strategic factors which are impacting on the region. And what causes a problem between Pakistan and the United States is one, the feeling in the United States, not the feeling, but the conviction in the United States that their debacle, that their defeat in Afghanistan at the hands of a ragtag army of the Taliban after 20 years is the responsibility of Pakistan. Had Pakistan not supported the Taliban, the Americans would have succeeded. So essentially, if you look at the congressional record, if you look at the statements, if you look at all the media commentaries, think tank analysis, after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, it becomes very clear that the US unanimously, with very few exceptions, blames Pakistan for their debacle in Afghanistan. So that is the one key area where we have a problem with Washington. The second related factor is that when the US under the Biden administration has sought to find allies in order to combat terrorism in Afghanistan and in the region, the Pakistani leadership has essentially said that it is not willing to be a partner in any more conflict, and has denied the availability of Pakistani territory for American bases to conduct these operations in Afghanistan. So that is another added factor. The third is, as I mentioned earlier, the growing relationship between Pakistan and China, and to a certain extent also the emerging relationship between Pakistan and Russia. So now let us look at the implications of the Ukrainian war on Pakistan. And let me begin by mentioning the visit of the Prime Minister to Russia a day before the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Now, the fact of the matter is that, yes, the situation was already very grim. The situation was already very tense. And we had to make a value judgment whether or not the Prime Minister should go. And I think the argument that weighed most is that Pakistan's interests vis-a-vis Ukraine are there, but they are not as important or as critical as its interests with Russia. And so if the Prime Minister, who had a month earlier accepted the invitation by the Russian president to visit Moscow, had at the last moment said that we cannot come, even if he said that the Prime Minister was diplomatically ill, that would not have washed in Moscow, which were emerging and are still emerging in a positive direction. So I think the decision was the correct decision to actually visit Moscow. The other factor, of course, was that this government in Pakistan in particular, but this is a process that has been happening with the previous governments as well, that we have moved towards a more balanced relationship with the three global powers. On the one hand, there even those who are and are still perhaps very keen on a relationship partnership with the United States and had great hopes that the Biden administration would provide a different approach to Pakistan as compared to Trump, were sorely disappointed. And I remember in a discussion like this, when some of my former colleagues made the argument that, oh, Biden once told Karzai, or Ashraf Ghani, one of them, that Pakistan is 10 times or 100 times more important for us than Afghanistan. That was not a compliment. That was a statement of how much concern the United States has vis-a-vis Pakistan. That was the reality. And that concern has played out for reason I just explained. So there is nothing, there is nothing on offer from the United States. We would be deluding ourselves to think that we have given up something very important by turning down the advice that was given to us by the Americans against visiting Moscow at this time. So, but there is a backstory that I mentioned, and whether or not my view is that whether or not the Prime Minister had gone to Moscow, the problems between Pakistan and the United States would have remained. The second thing is that in the present environment, the Western Bloc, led by the United States, has been demanding that Pakistan take a clear-cut stance against Russia and in favor of the Western condemnation and the Western policies towards Russia. Now, as I said, in terms of interests, Pakistan's interests vis-a-vis Ukraine, there are interests. We do buy arms and we do technology and other things. But in terms of weighing the two interests, the interests with Russia are far more important. So to say that we should have sacrificed those interests with Russia, I don't think makes any sense. The second, the other part of the problem is that we do believe that the Russians should not have invaded an independent country. We do believe that this invasion is contrary to international law and the UN Charter. But at the same time, we have made the argument that the security interests of all the parties concerned, including the Russians, must be taken into account. We cannot argue that Russians are acting simply out of being a malignant power, but they are acting out of their national interest, and that national interest needs to be respected and addressed. And the third point is that this environment is creating a major difficulty for developing countries with increasing prices, etc., and all that. So let me now conclude by just saying a few words about policy options for Pakistan. As I said, the relationship with Ukraine is not as critical as relations with Russia or China, and therefore we need to follow a path which is balanced, particularly between the three major powers. US has in effect very little leverage or very little on offer, for which we need to sacrifice something that is potentially in the pipeline with the Russians. So the choice should be very clear. We also need to be very clear that eventually the West will need to recognize Russian interests to end the Ukraine war. They are already talking about Ukrainian neutrality. Unfortunately, what is happening is that the Western countries are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, which is unfortunate because it's the Ukrainians who are being killed. But eventually, Ukrainians, despite the help from the West, are in no position to defeat the Russian army. So it's very clear that at the end of the day, there will need to be some kind of solution. It's in Pakistan's long-term interest to pursue the balanced policy between the three major powers in the world, which is now clearly multilateral or multipolar. It's a multipolar world. The US is no longer the sole superpower. The global order has changed, and Russia has demonstrated very clearly that the US is no longer the preeminent power which can dictate to the other major powers. This is a very clear factor. Another important factor in this whole episode, or in this whole development, is that the primary beneficiary of all this is China. Because not only has the US been forced to shift its focus from the Asia Pacific, from containing China, to focus on Europe. Secondly, it has strengthened the China-Russia relationship even further. Despite Western narratives that the Chinese are concerned or the Russians are doing, the fact remains that the Russia-China strategic partnership is stronger now than before. Another factor that will emerge out of this is their joint efforts, and not only their efforts, but remember that other major countries in our region, including India, which is a strategic partner of the United States, has refused American pressure to join the Western alliance against Russia for its own interests, which also shows that the Indians are pursuing their own independent policy in a multi-polar world. And so, in this environment, the situation in our region, the situation in the world, is going to be an extremely complex process by which through which we will have to navigate. The unfortunate part is that at a time when Pakistan needs more than anything else the environment of national unity and cohesion, we are in the process of dismantling our political system. So that is, I think, the most tragic thing that Pakistan politicians